We're on episode 3 of All Strut No Fret, and that means it's the last one on Henry V. And I've made it sound as if the whole play is just Henry talking, which it's not at all. Of course, it's full of battles, it's full of other colourful characters, and if you really want to have some fun, find a friend and read aloud Princess Catherine's English lesson together. Let me tell you, it's a treat. But with this last video, because we don't have a lot of time, I just need to let you into the big important secret that most people don't want to talk about because they think that it makes it sound harder, but it's such a mistake. So much becomes easier in understanding Shakespeare when you grapple with the fact that the plays that Shakespeare writes are almost entirely written in poetry. We call it verse in the business, but poetry is what it is, and all that means is that every line on the page has a rhythm to it. It has a beat, a number of syllables, and finding where those lie is what's going to help you, and I'm going to show you some tricks for figuring out where that rhythm falls and what you can learn from it. We've reached step 3 and it looks really simple, but there's one thing you have to do each and every time before you can make this trick work for you. You have to establish whether the part of the play you're looking at is written in verse or written in prose. And once you learn to do that, it's going to become the fundamental building block to your understanding whatever play, whatever speech you're looking at. When you see a page that looks like this, that looks like an ordinary book, you see along the right-hand side here, all the lines end in a neat line. That means you're looking at prose. Looks like an ordinary novel or a modern play, and that's because none of the lines have a rhythm. When you look at Shakespeare, though, almost all the time, you're going to be seeing pages that look like this instead. And that means these lines are written in verse. That means that there's a certain number of syllables in each line, usually 10, not always, but most of the time. And when you get to the end of the 10 syllables, that's when the line ends and you start a new one. And that gives the whole play rhythm, and that's what we call blank verse. And so the first thing you need to do is look at the right-hand end of the lines and decide whether you're looking at prose or whether you're looking at verse. We're going to look at this example of one of Henry's speeches, which is in verse. You know it's verse straight away because if you look down the left-hand side, all the lines begin with a capital letter, and if you look down the right-hand side, it's all wiggly. Now later on we're going to have a lot of fun looking at things like rhetorical devices and marking out the scansion. That's in later videos. Today, all we're going to do is look at the last word of each line. Now this doesn't work with prose, it only works with verse, so that's why I told you that the first thing you have to do is figure out when you're looking at verse. And the reason it works this way is that Shakespeare's actors knew how to speak verse, so they knew how to hit the last word of every line and make it a big deal and really make it heard. And that means Shakespeare knew to put what was important at the end of the line. And now we can reverse engineer that to find what's important in the speech by looking at what the playwright wanted the actors to make sure the audience heard by looking at that last word of each line of verse. So let's try it out just by reading the first few lines in full and taking it from there. O God of battle, steel my soldiers' hearts. Possess them not with fear, take from them now the sense of reckoning, ere the opposed numbers pluck their hearts from them, not today, O Lord. Imagine if you missed most of what was in that speech. You would still hear, hearts, now, numbers, Lord. You would still get a clear sense of what was mattering to the speaker. Let's go down further and see what we have as a whole in this speech. Hearts, now numbers, Lord. Fault, crown, new tears, blood. Pay, hold up, built. Priests. I'm going to cheat here and look at the last 4 words for the next line. More will I do. What you hear there is that after more than a dozen fairly dense and complicated lines, you suddenly break into 4 simple monosyllables at the end of that line. More will I do. And those will hit the audience's ear with enormous clarity. And then we finish with worth all pardon. Just by looking at these highlighted words, you can figure out that what's going on in this speech is that King Henry is trying to convince God that he is worthy to win the battle that's happening the next morning. This job the king, the playwright, the actor has of being perpetually convincing and persuasive is so much easier for film Henrys because they can surround themselves with troops, they can ride horses, they can stay on their horses while leading their troops. Think about how Shakespeare knew how much harder it was going to be for his Henry, who was just a bloke on a stage with his words. Remember back to the prologue that told us it's our job to hear those words and do the rest with our imagination. Henry in the theatre doesn't get to surround himself with horses or a view over a vasty battlefield. All he gets to work with are his words and his ability to reach your imagination. And it's really fun to watch him find a way to persuade differently, dependent on who his audience is each time and what he needs to get from them. You can go back and look at the list of big speeches I gave you earlier running throughout the play and think about how he approaches each one differently depending on what he needs. After hearing him make a bargain with God and looking at some pictures of him rallying his forces, let's take a minute to consider a contrasting scene. Let's see what he does when what he has to do is persuade the Princess Catherine to marry him. Henry has one job in this scene, and that's to woo the princess, and everybody knows that romantic scenes get played in verse. That's what verse is for, it's for wooing. And yet somehow, first time in the play, here he is, enormous chunks of speeches in prose. What's going on with that? This just shows us how clever Henry, or rather Shakespeare, is, because he's remembering that persuasion is situational. You have to adapt to fit what results you want to get out of your audience. In this case, his audience is Catherine, and he needs to convince this woman that he's not trying a line on her, so his line becomes to pretend that he doesn't have a line because he wouldn't even know how. So he speaks in prose like an ordinary person. And it works. So are you learning about what makes a great king here, or what makes a great playwright? To review, our goals here are to get you to the point where when you enter a Shakespeare play, when you pick it up or listen to it, you know what to do to get you started. And once you've done that, that you will leave feeling that you have understood what you've done. We're focusing on identifying what the right questions are. And our first few questions to get you started on that are to ask who is speaking in a scene and who is listening. Then to ask the notes, which are the ones that are going to help me. And then to ask the last word of each line, what are you telling me about what is important in this scene? Try it out on Henry. Choose one of the many long speeches he makes and just figure out where he is and who it is he's talking to. Look down below and identify which are the useful notes. Then read out the last word of each line aloud to yourself and ask yourself the crucial question, what does he want you to do? Most of all, you should ask yourself, is Henry's mastery of rhetoric working on you? Start to practice becoming that engaged audience member described by the prologue, using your imagination to be the thing that activates the words you're hearing from any of the characters in any of these plays. In the next set of videos, you'll be taking those new skills in asking the right questions and using them to take a fresh look at Romeo and Juliet and asking the characters in that play, well, which of you can persuade me to love you?